Maybe they feel that there just is not a deal to be had, and they will be better somehow just leaving the EU with no deal at all.
No, I'm sorry, but that's not the case. And Boris Johnson cares about one thing only, which is what he's always cared about. This is Boris Johnson in power.
In Britain's unwillingness to compromise and its unwillingness to be sensible.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Backstory. I'm your host, Dana Lewis, broadcasting this week from the Côte d'Azur in the south of France. With my family, I drove here from London. The Eurotunnel was filling up with people like us who didn't want to risk air travel. People sensibly wearing masks in shops, by the way, mandatory in a mall we entered in Monaco. We've even had our temperature taken before being allowed onto the patio of an outdoor restaurant. The virus is taken extremely seriously here, as it should be. France was one of the first to lock down, Britain one of the last. No wonder the UK has suffered so many deaths, third highest after America and Brazil. On Backstory, just as the UK tries to reopen, it may be slammed with a second wave, and its economy will get hit with a double whammy, a pandemic and an ill-timed exit from Europe, which polls now say most Brits don't want.
We can get a fantastic new free trade agreement with the EU by the end of 2020, and we will not extend the transition period beyond the end of 2020. There's absolutely no need to do that.
The UK left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020 and is now in an 11-month transition period. During this period, the UK effectively remains in the EU's customs union and single market and continues to obey EU rules. However, it is no longer part of political institutions. So, for example, there are no longer any British MEPs, that's members of European Parliament, but we have one with us on Backstory, a former European Member of Parliament from London, and our other important guest, one of our regular political commentators, and there's lots to talk about. Let's switch to the United Kingdom and talk to political commentator Jo Phillips and also the former member of European Parliament, Irina von Wiese. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, Dana.
Hi.
We start with COVID-19 because the country has lost more than 50,000 people to the virus. The actual figure may be 70,000. And as I'm speaking to you from the south of France, where I've escaped with my family for a brief vacation, we drove, no planes, no trains, no crowded beaches right now. The deaths here are about 30,000, more than half of what the UK has. Why is it so bad there?
Well, we were very, very slow off the mark, weren't we? And I think, the UK government has been stumbling around. They missed the early warning signs. They went into some sort of denial. They weren't ready to cope with it. The track and trace has been a total shambles. And the messaging since lockdown has been absolutely chaotic. And we still now discover today that figures have been released showing COVID-19 deaths, even if somebody got hit by a bus and died as a result of a road traffic accident. So there's a whole lot of skepticism and distrust. And of course, the other thing that's happened...
Well, I'm going to want to jump in there really quickly because that may be a bit of a smokescreen by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary of Britain, who up until now has lied about testing, lied about medical protective gear, and suddenly, a lot of people not following the UK news won't understand that he suddenly said today that they have put out statistics in the past where people had COVID-19 and then later on died, but probably didn't die from COVID-19, but from some other cause of death, and that has somehow torqued the statistics. And he's trying to suggest that, it could be very dramatic. Now, I tend to think it probably is not very dramatic.
No, I don't think it is. And anyway, if the people who died still had COVID-19, it is still an infection. And it's not just the deaths that we need to be looking at. It's the infection and the rate of infection.
Irina, you want to take a run at that before we move on the numbers?
Well, I think we have to look at the bigger picture here and why it is that certain countries have fared so much better than others. And we also have to look at what does it say about the style of government why is it that authoritarian governments have done, particularly right-wing authoritarian governments across the globe, have done phenomenally badly in this pandemic, from Brazil to the United States to, sadly, the United Kingdom? And I think it does have to do with trust, and I think it also has to do with the degree to which now we're used to having disinformation and simply distorted facts presented to us.
Are you calling the United Kingdom and the United States authoritarian governments?
I am indeed, and I do that very deliberately because I believe that we are at a state now where the disinformation has taken on such a proportion that there is simply no more trust in the government. The numbers that we have been presented, as Jo very rightly said, are all over the place. People do not trust these governments anymore. And let me be very specific. What I mean about authoritarian is not, of course, a regime that is void of any democratic control. There has been an attempt to hold the government to account. But I believe that having, the kind of majorities that we see in the House of Commons, the majority of the Conservative Party of 80, has really given Boris Johnson the idea that he can really, impose his own ideas, which were all over the place, without really being held to account.
Yeah, I think the point you're raising about accountability is pretty important. And
it's interesting that the three of the countries that you mentioned, Irina, USA, UK, and Brazil, of course, have got three men leading them who have got egos the size of their own countries, if not the planet, who won't listen to anybody else and will do things their own way. And the countries where the pandemic has been handled well have been, by and large, led by women. And most of the, it's certainly in the UK government, it is a very male government and surrounded by male advisors. And those men, you mentioned Matt Hancock earlier, they won't put their hand up and say, hang on a minute, how's that going to work? Because those sort of men would never, ever show that they didn't agree. They're on a greasy cloth for themselves.
But I mean, in fairness to the government, there are lots of very bold men in government, some of them in the Conservative Party, who have been silenced by Boris Johnson or pushed to the back benches. And they have stood up and really sounded alarm bells. There is going to be a public inquiry of some kind that has been called for by the opposition parties. And now the Prime Minister has acknowledged that there will be an inquiry of some kind, which will be interesting how they set the framework for that. And they'll obviously try to set it in favorable terms for number 10 Downing Street and Boris Johnson. But, the UK was hit worst of all in Europe. And now you have this government report which says there could be 120,000 more deaths this winter. Now, if that is true, that is a shockingly high second wave.
And we still don't have the track and trace system up and running. We've still got people who are waiting for normal medical procedures, whether it's operations or cancer treatment or other forms of treatment, screening and testing. So you're building up this huge backlog of health problems. And we still don't know, and this is not just a UK thing, this is worldwide, we still don't know the long-term effects of coronavirus on people's hearts and respiratory systems and their brains. So we don't know what we're storing up in terms of trouble. And
that may explain the problem at number 10 Downing Street, because Boris Johnson had it. I'm sorry, that's a nasty joke. But I mean, clearly there is a lack of leadership, both in the United States.
If he hadn't had it, we'd have been even worse. We'd have been like Brazil, because I don't think he even believed it existed until he was so seriously ill. But this is a government that will be, we think the NHS is wonderful, let's all go out and clap for carers, and then slaps car parking charges on the poor people going to work in hospitals.
All right, for people not from the UK, the NHS is a national healthcare system, and they have been sending out parking tickets to healthcare workers that are obviously parking nearby hospitals so they can get to work and save people's lives. Irina, are you going to put your kids back in school this fall? I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to. I've got a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old. Your daughter's how old?
My daughter will be 16 as well, so she missed out on one of her key exams. Yes, I am putting her back in school. I think that it is key that we do get the education system back up and running, because the long-term cost of that gap in education, particularly for those children who already have an attainment gap, is going to be enormous. And I think it is desperately unfair on that younger generation. Am I worried? Yes, of course I'm worried. Her father is immunocompromised. I think it is a very personal decision that everybody has to make for themselves. But what we're seeing now is that the lockdown, the long-term consequences of the lockdown are going to be much, much more wide-reaching, and will also uncover divisions in our society.
Can I talk to you about that, since you've raised it? Because I know you wrote a pretty interesting article that kind of got me interested in talking to you today more than anything, and that is that you talk specifically about London and the two Londons. Because there are a lot of rich people in London and well-off people in London who have been pretty well immune from this, not all of them, but they have been able to isolate and be able to stay away from work and work from home. But frontline people, which draw on some of the least economically well-off in London, have had to go to work, and a lot of them have gotten sick.
Yes, well, Charles Dickens described the tale of two cities. And I have to say, Dana, I was absolutely shocked. And this is not something that should come really as a surprise. But when I started cycling to London at the beginning of lockdown, I needed to get some exercise. So I got on my bike and I cycled through where I live, which is West London, and then across the Thames and down to South London. And it was striking. There was nobody in the streets in the affluent boroughs, such as Kensington, Westminster. And then when you get to South London, it's like entering a completely different world. Not only was there no sign of social distancing, of lockdown anywhere, there were people queuing. And I realized they weren't queuing for groceries like elsewhere. They were queuing for cash machines because they didn't have access to contactless or even to a credit card. And then I started talking to people, and they said to me, well, I'm being sent out to work in highly dangerous environments as a bus driver, as an Uber driver, as security guards, or indeed as NHS staff. And then you're asking me in my free time that I can't see my grandchildren or my grandparents, for that matter, or my loved ones, that I can't go out. So obviously, it is a completely different picture. We have 4 times more people getting infected and dying from this disease from the most deprived parts of society than from the richest parts.
I suspect, Joe, that's just not London. That's probably major cities all over the world.
I think it is probably major cities all over the world, but I don't think it's exclusive to cities. I think it's more visible, the difference in cities. But where I live, on the English coast, we have pockets of great deprivation. And actually, there are 2 areas not far from me that may be going into localized lockdown. There's a real problem, and Irina's absolutely right. If you don't have access to contactless payment, if you don't have access to computers and stuff to help your kids learn when they will have been off school for 6 months by the time in September, if you're a private renter, a private tenant, you're at the mercy of your private landlord. And as Irina rightly says, the people who are working in the jobs as security guards, cleaners, delivery drivers, healthcare assistants, these are the people who we know have been bearing the brunt, the toll of death and illness across the board through this, and particularly people from the Black and ethnic minority communities.
I guess what makes me scratch my head is, and first of all, my heart goes out to those people, and we hope that they have jobs at the end of this, and they're able to support their families, and they're able to do it in a safe way. Because I think there's at least 24 bus drivers, for instance, that have died in London from COVID-19 and staying on the front line and staying on the job while all of this has taken place. And there have been deaths from people who work in the tube as well. And but I personally think, and I'll bounce this off both of you, and you can jump on me if I'm thinking the wrong way, but isn't it a bit ridiculous always to blame big business and wealth in London for everybody's ills when they employ millions of people and account for 23% of the UK economy? And so we have to be able to talk about the have-nots without dragging the people who do work and do supply employment through the streets over it. It's not.
But I don't think anybody. But Dana, I don't think anybody's blaming wealthy people. It is the structure of our society.
But there's a lot of hostility towards London.
There's a lot of hostility, and I can tell you that, you know, an awful lot of those empty places that Irina was cycling past, most of them were coming to their second homes down here, much to the resentment of local people who live in these small coastal communities.
Down here is you're how far from London again?
I'm 60 miles from London.
So a lot of them
So
are
I'm
driving out of the city.
the first bit of seaside you come to when you head south. But I mean, it's not about wealthy people, but it is about how we are aware of each other. And that is down to government. And I think it's also down to the Mayor of London, who I think has had a terrible, terrible pandemic. He has not been brave. He has not stood up to government. He hasn't insisted on proper safeguards for the people who actually come under his auspices, like the transport workers who drive the buses and the underground.
A lot of
trains.
people say he was very late to even get them protective masks. And,
Absolutely.
Irina, do you want to jump in?
I totally agree. He was too late, but I wouldn't put the main blame at his feet either. I do think that this is a systemic problem which has pre-existed the pandemic. It has become obvious now, but it is something that we should have addressed, of course, decades ago, when the income gap and the wealth gap, specifically in London, were wider and wider and wider. And no, it is not the fault of the business or even the incentives given to businesses, whose positive role I fully acknowledge. It really is a problem about housing, transport, and other policies, that infrastructure that have been completely ignored over many, many decades. And really a powder case, which is now about to blow up. But it's also, I think, about this.
Why do you say it's a powder keg about to blow up?
Well, I mean, I'm because I work with some of these deprived communities, and the truth is that Black Lives Matter, for example, there was a specific reason why this came out now. But it's not like we haven't had problems with racism over so many years. And so many people, not just BMAE people, feel completely disenfranchised. They don't trust the government.
What will be the explosion? What will be the, as you say, it's going to blow up? What is going to blow up?
Well, I think we now see that so many more people from these deprived communities are dying. And we start asking ourselves, why are they dying? They're not just dying of COVID. They're dying of other diseases. They're dying, frankly, of poverty. And they're also dying probably from lack of access to basic infrastructure, healthcare, etc. And all of this has now come to a point where I think, as a society, we've really reached a catastrophic level. And this is just the beginning of it. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound like one of these doomsday.
No, I mean, it's interesting that that's your take on it. Jo, is that your take on it? I mean, that yes, people are suffering. Yes, we're in a catastrophe. There is no doubt. Do you feel that there's a ticking time bomb on the street? Because a lot of people relate that to America, but not to the UK.
I don't know. I think there will be flashpoints, but I think the flashpoints will come, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion, but they're more likely to come from illegal raids, frankly, and people not social distancing. I think the real problem is, yes, disenfranchisement and complete distrust in government. And unless you have the public with you, you actually can't govern. So the next time you say, oh, we've got a spike, it's October, we've got winter flu, we've got a spike in coronavirus, we're going into lockdown. Why would anybody listen to you?
Yeah, I think they're going to have as a resident of London myself, I think they're going to have a hell of a time trying to get people to go back inside and another lockdown, especially after this moron, Dominic Cummings, the right-hand man of the Prime Minister, went out for a joyride to test his eyes. I mean, come on, with his family.
He drove
I think that
miles.
I think for everybody that was a kind of cold water on everybody, and they just said, okay, this is not a serious lockdown. If he can do it, we can do it. Look, in the middle of all of this, you have Brexit looming, which nobody's talking about much. I mean, it's beginning now to get back into the front page because the deadline is coming very quickly. So you have the shaking pandemic rattling the foundations of economies around the world. And the UK seems to be heading for a no-deal Brexit. Would both of you agree that looks like what's on the horizon, and what does it mean?
Yes, Dana, I think unfortunately you're absolutely right about this. We have been talking about this quite a lot with, my European friends. I'm a dual citizen, so I also work with EU citizens who still live in the UK and are very worried about their future. What we're going to see is, at very best, towards the end of the year, some form of skeleton agreement, more likely some a completely fractured, little agreement on some lesser important areas of cooperation. But there is no chance that we can still get a comprehensive deal. It would have to be agreed by October in order to be ratified by December. So
Joe, do you agree with that? Sorry to cut you off, Irina, but Joe, do you think we're heading in for a no-deal Brexit?
Yes, I do, because I think Boris Johnson doesn't care, and I think it's a real shame because Tony Blair, the former...
How can he not care? He was elected...
Because that's what he got elected on. He wants to deliver Brexit. He doesn't care about the consequences any more than he cares about the consequences of a policy that thinks it's more important to get people back to the pub than kids to go back to school. Interestingly, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, had commissioned a report that was published this week, and what that report is recommending is a delay of 12 months. Now, this isn't extending the extension period.
But Boris Johnson would have to ask for it.
But yeah, Boris Johnson would have to ask for it, and that comes back to the machismo thing. Would he do that? He doesn't have to break his promise. He doesn't have to renege on his promise of not asking for an extension. This would give a year to unravel and to sort of nail down some of the things.
Yeah, but he's not going to do it. And do you really think
he's not going to do it?
Let's cut him a little bit of slack here. I mean, maybe it's not ego. Maybe they feel that there just is not a deal to be had, and they will be better somehow just leaving the EU with no deal at all.
I'm sorry, but that's not the case. Boris Johnson cares about one thing only, which is what he's always cared about. This is Boris Johnson in power.
Exactly.
He could have had a deal. I don't think he ever wanted a deal. Now, of course, he has found the perfect excuse because he's going to blame the economic fallout from a no-deal Brexit, on the pandemic. This is exactly what he's going to do come next year. This has nothing to do with Brexit. This is all because of the pandemic. And it'll be very, very hard, of course, to fight that argument. So I'm afraid
that's pretty short term, though, isn't it? I mean, that's a short horizon. I mean, if you deliver Brexit by crashing out, I mean, the next chapter is a very dark one economically, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's going to be dark anyway because of coronavirus. And what he will do, I still think he will stand down when the going gets tough and the questions begin to have to be answered properly. I still think he will say, I'm not properly recovered. I must stand down for my health and leave someone else.
Jo Phillips, you were the first and only person to say this to me. And you told me that before. You actually think he may simply walk out of number 10 Downing around Christmas time?
I think he's a prime minister for the good times. He doesn't actually pay attention to detail. We know that from his time as mayor of London, and he's admitted himself he hasn't even read the report into the second wave of coronavirus. He's not looking at these Brexit negotiations. He just wants to say, I delivered Brexit, aren't I great?
Yeah, everybody else can clean up the mess after that.
Exactly.
The pollsters say if there was another referendum today, a fair one, not forced by the Leave campaign and without Russian interference, and no doubt there was, Britain would vote to stay in the EU. I mean, that seems tragic at this point.
Incidentally, Dana, that was already true in December before the December 12th elections. And the truth is that 53%, almost 54% of the British population voted for parties in December last year that wanted a second referendum. So the likelihood is that their vote, if they want one, they would have voted to remain. That is the real tragedy of Brexit. And we know that even more people today are starting to see what a catastrophic outcome this will be for Britain in the longer run. But of course, it is too late. And it is also almost too late for a comprehensive deal. So I'm afraid I have to agree with you that the outlook is extremely bleak. We're looking at a double whammy to the British economy. And the sad thing, the really tragic thing, is that the Johnson government has managed to mess it both up. He has not prevented the deaths, and he has not prevented the tragic outcome of a lockdown. So we've got the economic consequences of the lockdown, and we've got the health consequences of the lack of lockdown at the beginning. And
Why
that,
should
to me,
anyone,
is true
why should
tragedy.
anyone other than the UK care about whether the UK leaves the European Union? I mean, if you're an American, if you're living in Europe, have people kind of already come to terms with it, and they say, okay, Britain
Yeah,
has to do their
well,
own.
but I think we are in this global crisis, which is not just COVID-19, it's the climate emergency. We see an increasingly isolationist America under Trump, and we see China and Russia becoming much, much more assertive. So the world has turned on its head, if you like, and that's been accelerated by coronavirus for sure. But it's also, if you start having people leaving the club, I think it did shake the EU and our EU partners at the beginning of the referendum result. But I think Britain's unwillingness to compromise and its unwillingness to be sensible, where you could actually say to people, look, there are events beyond our control. We're going to have a year where we hammer out these details, but I'm not going back on my deal. That would actually give breathing space.
I mean, there are parallels between the Trump victory and the Brexit victory. And a lot of people think that Trump is headed for a major defeat in November based on current polling and the change of demographics in America. And I tend to agree with that. I don't think, unless something amazing happens, I think Joe Biden's going to win it. And a lot of people think that Boris Johnson's future is wrapped up, and maybe Brexit is wrapped up in this as well, that people that were against immigration are now more pro-immigration, for instance.
Dana, I wish you were right, but unfortunately, unlike our friends in the US, we do not have a chance, unless something very drastic happens, to vote again. We had the chance, and the chance was lost. And I think we have to come to terms now that at least some form of Brexit is going to be implemented. And indeed, we cannot go back, even if we wanted to, because of course that would take two to tango. But back to your question, why should others care? I talk a lot to my former colleagues at the European Parliament and to my friends across the continent.
Yeah, what do they
And
say?
people do care. They do care greatly about Britain, because we are at a crossroads where multilateralism as such is threatened, and where the European Union is the last remaining democratic bloc of nations that can stand up to the bullies in China and in Russia and elsewhere. So, and I do think that it matters. And even if we do see change,
the UK is standing
US
in China right now, whether they leave.
We can't rely on the US trade deal. We simply can't. So the close cooperation with Europe, with our friends in the European Union, will remain absolutely crucial for both sides, in my view.
Joe?
No, I agree.
The UK is already standing up to China now anyway. So whether they're in the EU or out of the EU, it looks like their foreign policy will be to take China on.
Standing up to China, I don't think so. And we see the report this week about, Russia trying to steal the vaccine details and all the rest of it. But standing up on your own isn't the same as standing up with other people.
Yes.
It's just ridiculous.
China is just laughing. Yeah. I mean, they already have, and the worry thing of which I've worked on quite intensely in a previous incarnation where I was working in the ICT industry. I mean, it's too late. Their infrastructure is already in the ground. It is now extremely difficult to really rip that all up. And let's not forget, we still have massive Chinese investment in UK ports, in Hinkley C, the nuclear power plant, but also in infrastructure, utilities such as Thames Water, which is part owned by Chinese companies. Nobody knows this. But there is no way we can stand up to China as England. The Chinese are laughing. We are now on our own, completely insignificant on a world stage without the EU. And when I was working at the European Parliament, we nominated a Uyghur professor for the Sakharov Prize. And the Chinese were trying to shut this down, but they couldn't, because these were 28 countries working together. But, Britain on its own is already much too dependent in economic terms on China to really put our foot down or take a stance.
All right, to both.
And I
of
think,
go ahead, Joe.
well, just to say, I think it's not, Britain is becoming even more microscopic and insignificant because the way we're going, England is separate from Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland would much rather stay in the European Union. And there is, the whole coronavirus has strengthened their hand for Scottish independence. We are, I think, looking down not just the double barrel of a recession and a global pandemic again. I think we're looking down the fact that we will end up with a very tiny country, which is pretty much the M25, governed by a madman.
Wow, a madman. Britain's economy is likely to suffer the worst damage of the COVID-19 crisis of any country in the developed world, according to a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. You have a second wave of COVID-19 chasing after you. You've got Brexit on the front doorstep. Anybody want to say anything positive just to close out our segment here?
The weather is good.
I've had the virus already. No, I mean, it's not a great situation. I think there is, however, a realization by many people that they have to rethink the way that our society works, our economy works. And I do like the fact that people are talking more about investing in a green economy. I do like the fact that people are thinking about alternative structures of working, of commuting. And I do think that liberalism is not dead and that we will have a debate about disinformation and honesty in politics. I very much hope that will be one of the silver linings of this crisis.
I think it's given all of us a chance, whether we wanted it or not, to reflect and to a certain extent recalibrate. And I think for many individuals and families, it's meant that, exactly as Irina says, people have questioned whether they need to spend 5 hours a day commuting to do stuff that they could just as easily do at home. It's a great shame that our government and other governments around the world don't seem to be using this time to go, hang on, we could actually do things so much better.
Forced recalibration with Jo Phillips and Irina von Wiese. Thank you so much, the two of you, for your insight and commentary today.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson's strategy may be that a no-deal Brexit would be lost in the continuing economic horrors of the pandemic. He is obsessed by pursuing a policy of self-harm for the British economy via Brexit, say many. And some food for thought. President Trump's faltering political fortune pose another risk to Johnson's Brexit Britain. The president has enthusiastically supported Brexit and embraced the British Prime Minister as a like-minded populist. And bizarrely, Trump said recently the European Union was formed to take advantage of America.
The European Union was formed in order to take advantage of the United States. They formed and they take advantage of the United States. And I know that. They know I know that. But other presidents had no idea.
If President Trump were to lose in November, Prime Minister Johnson would face an uncertain counterpart in Joe Biden. December 31st, 2020, Britain may be on its own, locked out of the European common market with no significant trade deals in place, and an economy in far worse shape than the Great Depression. On that not-so-cheery note, that's this edition of Backstory. Thanks for listening. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you soon.